Okay, so I've spent the last 5 episodes asking questions about what the brain does with things it can't quite explain. We talked about consciousness, intuition, déjà vu, dreams that feel like they happened before the thing they were about. Spooky. Anyway, every time we landed in the same place, which is the felt sense that something is real even when you can't prove it, is one of the most deeply human experiences there is. We've been having it forever. Every culture, every era, and for most of history, the people who were most willing to sit with that feeling and to build a practice around it, to say out loud that there might be something on the other side of what we can measure, were women. So this episode, I wanted to follow a thread somewhere specific because I was sitting on the couch at an unreasonable hour, reading something on my phone that stopped me from scrolling. Someone had posted a comment on a Patreon thread that I am a part of, telling us all about this story out of Hanover, Pennsylvania in York County, which is maybe 2.5 hours from where I live in Bristol, Pennsylvania. And it was about a woman named Beck Lawrence, who owns a shop called the Serpent's Key Shop and Sanctuary, which is a witchcraft and apothecary store, which is the coolest kind of store, in my humble opinion. But anyway, the story was that a cop had walked into her store in October of 2023 and told her that offering tarot readings for money was illegal. I'm sorry, what? Since when? Since when is that illegal? I have gotten my tarot cards read in Pennsylvania more than once. My palm even. I've seen psychics. But this is not a local zoning thing. It's not a permit issue. I looked into it and it's an actual state law. A Pennsylvania statute, which is a misdemeanor of the 3rd degree, carrying up to a year in jail and a $2,500 fine. Yeah, that will stop you from scrolling. Beck went on TikTok and she went viral, which very good for her. That is the right move. But what I really couldn't get out of my head was the law itself. Pennsylvania Title 18, Section 7104. It makes it illegal to predict the future for profit. And I'm quoting, by cards, tokens, inspection of head or hands, consulting movements of heavenly bodies, or in any other manner. Spells, charms, necromancy, love potions. Let's go through them again. Cards, tokens, head or hands, heavenly bodies, spells, charms, necromancy, love potions, and let's not forget any other banner. All right. And this law that I had never heard of, it's because it's from 1861. Yep. 1861. And I sat there thinking, who was this law written for? Because somebody wrote that list, right? Somebody in Pennsylvania legislature in 1861 sat down and thought very carefully about cards and tokens and heavenly bodies and love potions. Now, they were describing something specific, a specific group of people doing specific things in the state. And that law has been on the books ever since, used as recently as 2023 in Lebanon County, 2018 in Beaver County, and 2007, the city of Philadelphia's Department of Licenses and Inspections shut down 16 fortune-telling shops in 3 days. And now, against Beck Lawrence in Hanover. So naturally, I went looking. I want to pick up a thread from episode 1. That is the one where we talked about Uranus and Gemini, where we talked about history rhyming, the way certain conditions seem to repeat across centuries and produce strikingly similar responses. You know, communication revolutions, social upheaval, institutions failing people faster than new ones can form. Episode 1 was like the macro view, and this episode was what it looks like on the ground. Because here's the thing. The conditions that produced modern tarot, astrology, witch talk boom like COVID, mass death, institutional collapse, economic disruption, etc., are almost identical to the conditions that produced the Victorian spiritualist movement 150 years ago. And if you go looking for who was at the center of that movement, who built the camps and the organizations and the professional networks and the mutual aid funds, it was women. Working women, named women, women with addresses and clients and regional reputations and income streams, at a time when almost every other professional path was close to them. And now, I've also spent the last several episodes exploring the brain's relationship with unexplained experiences. Intuition, déjà vu, precognitive dreams, the sense that something real is happening even when you can't prove it with a test or a scan. And these women were building their entire economies around that felt sense. And the state of Pennsylvania had a law on the books that classified them as criminals for doing it. That is not just a history story. That's the same argument we've been having this whole time, just with more muslin skirts and a lot more pleasure boats. So let's go back to the beginning. The house is in Hydesville, New York, small town, Wayne County, upstate. It is the night of March 31st, 1848, and the Fox family has been hearing knocking sounds in their house for weeks. Two sisters, Maggie Fox, 14 years old, Kate Fox, 11. And on this particular night, Kate decides to talk back. She calls out, and this is the quote that shows up in every account of this moment. She calls out, "Here, Mr. Splitfoot, do as I do." She claps, the knocking claps back. Maggie snaps her finger, it snaps back. Her mother, Margaret Fox, starts asking it questions. She asks how many children she has. The knocking answers correctly. She asks how old each child is. It answers correctly. She asks if it's a living person. Silence. She asks if it's a spirit. It raps yes. Word spread in days. Within weeks, the neighbors were coming over to sit in the room and listen. Within months, Maggie and Kate's older sister, Leah, had recognized what she had on her hands and started managing their appearances. By November of 1849, just 20 months after the first night, they were selling tickets to public demonstrations at Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York. The first paid seance in American history. In July of 1848, the same summer, the first women's rights convention in American history was held at Seneca Falls, New York. Same state, same year. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was there. A woman named Amy Post was there, who then attended Fox sister demonstrations that same summer and became a lifelong spiritualist supporter. And that's not a coincidence. Historian Anne Broad documented this in her 1989 book, Radical Spirits, Spiritualism and Women's Rights in 19th Century America. Her thesis is one of the more clarifying things written about this period. Spiritualism and women's rights were intertwined continually because spiritualism was the one public arena where women's authority was not just permitted, it was required. In every other professional or public context in 1848, women were subordinate to male clergy, male editors, male doctors, male lecturers. Women did not give public lectures. Women did not travel alone professionally. Women did not charge money for expert services. But a woman who was a medium was not claiming to speak for herself. She was channeling. She was the vessel for a higher power. And paradoxically, that framing, surrendering her own authority, gave spiritualist women a more real-world authority than any other available path. They traveled alone, they lectured to mixed-gender audiences, they had professional reputations and regional networks and income. They charged money for their services. And within 4 years of that first night in Hydesville, they had arrived in Pennsylvania. By 1852, there was a formal spiritualist organization in Philadelphia called the First Association of Spiritualists of Philadelphia, one of the oldest spiritualist organizations in the world, with at least 6 member groups practicing in and around Northern Liberties. By 1860, spiritualist circles were meeting in private homes across the state. Pittsburgh in the west, York, Lancaster, Scranton in the east, just people gathering in parlors and rented halls, trying to reach someone they'd lost. The establishment, though, was paying attention. The Public Ledger, a major Philadelphia paper, had readers writing in that year calling astrology and fortune-telling, quote, a very great evil with, quote, attending results from assignations to abortions and death, 1 year before the law passed. When the bill was being debated in Harrisburg, lawmakers in both Pennsylvania House and Senate tried to limit it to Philadelphia only. A newspaper in Carlisle, the Carlisle Weekly Herald in Cumberland County, published an editorial supporting the statewide bill, saying, "The bill is calculated to effectively crush out the swindling impostors who have imposed upon and filched money. Philadelphia has been cursed for years with these adventurers." Philadelphia has been cursed. That is the language they used. But the bill did not stay limited to Philadelphia. It passed statewide, and it had been statewide for 165 years. Let's jump forward to 1913. Where in the 7th Ward of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a neighborhood shaped by segregation where the city's Black residents were concentrated by design. Picture the heat of a summer afternoon, narrow streets, row houses close together. A woman named Minerva Mullen was walking the pavement. She's an undercover anti-vice investigator hired by the city. Her job? Find commercial sex, gambling, and anything deemed disreputable. She visits 2 fortune tellers. The first is a white woman, a Mrs. Killinger on North Street, who tries to read Mullen's cards and tells her that her husband is running around on her. Mullen, who is a widow, points out that her husband is dead. Mrs. Killinger becomes, according to Mullen's notes, very insulting. But the second fortune teller, his name is Thomas E. Wilson. He lives on West Grant Street, and he is known around Lancaster as the hoodoo doctor. He practiced hoodoo, a tradition rooted in Central and Western African spiritualist practices preserved and adapted by enslaved Africans in the United States. He conjured spirits, made herbal remedies, worked within a tradition completely separate from the European spiritualism, but just as real to the people who sought him out. The chambermaid at Mullen's Hotel had mentioned him unprompted. "He has been working for me for a year now. He tells wonderful. He can put spells on people. They can't work, makes them sick." Mullen goes to see Wilson, and Wilson looks at her. And he says, "You make me chilly and uneasy. I can't tell, but somehow you smell like death and ruin to me." And he was right. He had been charged with fortune-telling in 1901, charged again in 1910, because he kept practicing anyway, because people needed what he offered. Hold Thomas Wilson next to white mediums meeting in the parlors of Philadelphia, because they are different versions of the same story. People using spiritual practice to earn a living outside a system that offered them no other options. And the state had a sweeping law from 1861 that could turn any of them into a criminal at any given moment. The law listed cards, tokens, heavenly bodies, spells, charms, necromancy. It listed everything because there was too many of them to name. Now, it would be easy to sit here today and say that it was all Victorian superstition, right? Because people believed things then that we would never believe today. But the people seeking out seance rooms and hoodoo doctors were not fools. They were in genuinely catastrophic conditions, doing the most human thing available to them, which was looking for proof that death wasn't the end. The Civil War killed up to 750,000 soldiers, which is roughly 1 in 10. Which is the equivalent today of 6 or 7 million people dead. And look what happened to the bodies, right? Men were dying hundreds of miles from home on battlefields in Virginia, Georgia, Tennessee, and they didn't have dog tags. There was no coordinated recovery system. A mother in Pittsburgh or in Bristol could spend years not knowing if her son was dead, captured, or lying in an unmarked grave somewhere. In Georgia, there was no mechanism to find out. And Mary Todd Lincoln had seances in the White House Red Room after her son Willie died in 1862. So if the president's wife was doing this openly in the executive mansion, imagine what was happening in every other house across Pennsylvania. A Boston spiritualist newspaper, which was called the Banner of Light, ran a column throughout the Civil War called Messages from Dead Soldiers, which was mediums claiming to have received communications from soldiers killed at the front. Whether the messages were real is besides the point. The column ran because thousands of families just needed it to run. And then in September of 1873, the panic hit. J. Cook and Company, Philadelphia's most powerful bank, the one that had financed the Northern Pacific Railway, went bankrupt on September 18th. The New York Stock Exchange closed for 10 days for the first time in its history. Hundreds of banks failed, shifts got cut, workers returned to Europe. The Long Depression lasted 5 brutal years. On top of that, Philadelphia had experienced outbreaks of yellow fever. I kept seeing articles alongside the spiritualist ones all about yellow fever. And this epidemic had killed 1/10 of the city's population in 3 months during 1973. That's too recent, 1793. And that outbreak came back in 1820, 1853, 1870, 1876. It was like invisible forces were killing people you loved and no one could explain why and no one could stop it. And into all of that, spiritualism said the dead can still speak. Not the cold, Calvinistic comfort that their fate was sealed and unknowable, an actual answer, physical proof. Rapping sounds, materialized hands, messages that knew things they couldn't. The grief was real. The economic terror was real. The need was completely rational. And if you've been listening to the show, if you know anything about what we've talked about with deja vu, with precognitive dreams, with the brain's tendency to find signal in the noise when stakes feel high, none of this should be surprising. When the brain is under extreme stress and extreme grief, it reaches for pattern. It reaches for contact. It reaches for the felt sense that something meaningful is happening, even when nothing can be proven. These people weren't credulous. They were just human. In 1880, at the Neshaminy Falls Spiritualist Camp on the Neshaminy Creek in Bucks County, about 10 miles from where I grew up, there were 20,000 people on the ground on a single August Sunday. 20,000. The camp had been running annually since at least 1879. By 1880, they needed extra trains. The gatekeeper counted 1,500 carriages on one Sunday alone. Emma Hardinge Britton, one of the most celebrated spiritualist lecturers in the world who had spoken across England and Australia, came to Neshaminy Falls and addressed a crowd that stretched so far beyond the auditorium and out into the trees that people in the back couldn't even hear her. This was one of the largest religious assemblies in Pennsylvania that year. By 1885, the Bucks County Gazette was describing the scene: an orchestra, 2 miles of lake, 100 pleasure boats, colored lantern shows on Saturday nights, dancing in the pavilions. They explicitly advertised pure cold water springs, which in 1885 was health code for "you will not catch yellow fever here." The destination, a professional operation, a summer cultural event with a Philadelphia address, a welfare fund for members in need, and a law on the books that applied to every medium, giving private sittings in every tent on those grounds. Pennsylvania wasn't a provincial bubble. The Bucks County Gazette, our little local paper, was following international spiritualist celebrity drama the way we follow pop culture. In December 1874, the Gazette reviewed the Galaxy magazine's profile of Daniel Douglas Home, the Scottish-American medium who had performed for Napoleon III, for Tsar Alexander II of Russia. He claimed to levitate, to elongate his body. Credentialed witnesses across Europe couldn't explain what they'd seen. Robert Browning, the Victorian poet, attended one of Holmes's seances in Florence in 1855 with his wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Elizabeth was a believer. Robert was a furious skeptic. At the seance, Holmes allegedly caused a spirit hand to materialize and place a laurel wreath on Elizabeth's head, bypassing Robert entirely. Browning was so incensed, he wrote a 1,500-line satirical poem demolishing Holmes as a fraud. By 1876, our little Bucks County Gazette was publishing a letter from Browning himself clarifying whether the seance had inspired it. A small-town paper in southeastern Pennsylvania was carrying Browning's international correspondence about a seance in Florence. The difference between 1876 and now isn't the content, it's the delivery system. Their version came by a post on a page too. Our version is a 60-second TikTok. But underneath the international drama were local working women, and I want to name them because they deserve to be named. The Bucks County Gazette, July 12, 1906, announcement of weekly meeting at Parkland Heights Spiritualist Camp. It lists the mediums and lecturers for that Sunday. Every single one of them is a woman. Mrs. Fanny Allen, lecturer, a traveling professional who gave public talks to mixed-gender audiences at a time when it still required a certain kind of nerve. Mrs. Augusta O. Volk, medium. She ran private sittings and charged per session. This was her income, her livelihood, her professional identity. Mrs. Hannah Luger, lecturer. Mrs. Snyder, Mrs. Monger, Mrs. Elwinger, all working mediums. The proceeds from these meetings went to the Home Fund, a welfare and mutual aid network for spiritualists in need. This was an economy, a professional guild, a community infrastructure built and sustained by women who had income, regional reputations, and networks of colleagues, at a time when the law denied them a voice in almost every other civic space. They were the professional women of their era, in a category the era had barely invented yet. And back in Harrisburg, the 1861 law was still on the books, waiting. Really quick disclaimer, in this next section, I am going to directly quote some old dead guys. So it's what they said, not what I said. So, yeah. The story doesn't have clean heroes. By the mid-1870s, the movement was full of documented fraud. The Gazette ran exposés on mediums caught hiding artificial cloth flowers made from bonnet trimmings to fake materializations. A male agent named Flint was arrested for steaming open letters that grieving families wrote to their deceased relatives, passing the contents to mediums for cold reading. He ran the entire scheme from his jail cell using a tin teapot. By 1876, a New York court ruled that mediums were, quote, simply jugglers and sleight-of-hand performers, subject to entertainment and licensing fees. And Pennsylvania had been ahead of that curve since 1861. And here's the part that stopped me cold. The Science History Institute, based in Philadelphia, which feels appropriate, traced the roots of Pennsylvania fortune-telling statute all the way back to King Henry VIII of England in 1530. Henry VIII issued laws targeting, here's the dead guy quotes, outlandish people calling themselves Egyptians, the Romani people, who used subtle and crafty means to deceive people. A decade later, he tied vagrancy, fortune-telling, and witchcraft together into a single criminal category. When the United States built its own laws, it drew on that same tradition. New Jersey banned fortune-tellers as disorderly persons in 1799. Pennsylvania coded its version in 1861, and when Pennsylvania updated the law in 1972, it swapped out the word gypsy for generic person. Otherwise, it's the same law. Historian Risa Miller has noted that statutes like this have consistently targeted two groups above all, women and the Roma. It was never a precision strike against fraud. It was a dragnet, a vague weapon that could be deployed against anyone whose spiritual practice didn't come with a steeple and tax exemption. And it stayed active. In 2007, the city of Philadelphia used this exact law to shut down 16 fortune-telling shops in 3 days. One of the practitioners called it what it was, discrimination. The law doesn't stop the practice, it just turns survival into a misdemeanor whenever the state decides to enforce it. Which brings us back to Hanover. On August 19th, 2024, Beck Lawrence filed a federal lawsuit against Hanover Police Chief Chad Martin and Hanover Borough. Her argument, Pennsylvania cannot criminalize a spiritual service for profit while mainstream churches collect offerings and priests take salaries. First Amendment, 14th Amendment, free speech, and equal protection. She said publicly, quote, "I'm not getting a single cent out of this. It has always been to protect spiritual practitioners and tarot readers in Pennsylvania." In 2025, she won a temporary injunction, which means Beck Lawrence is, at this moment, technically the only person in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania legally permitted to read tarot cards for profit. Everyone else is still a potential criminal. State Representative Greg Scott introduced House Bill 1562 to repeal Section 7104 entirely. His co-sponsorship memo, it's about the freedom of speech and the ability to practice your religion unencumbered. Pennsylvania Attorney General Dave Sunday intervened to defend the law. The sitting Attorney General of Pennsylvania went to federal court to argue that a pre-Civil War statute with direct lineage to Henry VIII's targeting of Romani people as outlandish Egyptians belongs in our modern books. 165 years, same list, cards, tokens, heads or hands, heavenly bodies, spells, charms, necromancy, love potions. I want to come back to where I started. 5 episodes ago, I talked about history rhyming, the way certain conditions repeat and produce certain responses, the macro view. This is what the rhyme sounds like up close. Mass death, economic collapse, epidemic disease, institutional failure, and out of all of that, the same response. Women working outside established frameworks, building something that let people sit with the felt sense that the people they'd lost weren't entirely gone. That something was still there. That question was worth asking even without a satisfying answer. The original spooky girls were real. Mrs. Fanny Allen, Mrs. Augusta O. Volk, Mrs. Emma Hardin Britton, and Mrs. Hannah Luker. They had names and addresses and professional reputations and an orchestra and 100 pleasure boats on a summer lake. 20,000 people came out on a Sunday in August 1880 to sit along the Neshaminy Creek and feel like something was possible. Thomas Wilson on West Grand Street in Lancaster felt death and ruin would walk through his door and named it out loud. He kept his practice anyway. Beck Lawrence in Hanover walked into a legal fight she never knew would cost her years and told the court she wasn't doing it for money. 3 different people, 3 different centuries. The same door someone in authority keeps trying to close. I keep thinking about Kate Fox, 11 years old, in that house in Hydesville in 1848, calling out to whatever was making the noises in the walls. "Here, Mr. I can't talk. Here, Mr. Splitfoot, do as I do." She clapped, it clapped back. Whether or not anything supernatural was happening that night, that moment launched something. Women building professional lives in the one space where their authority was not just tolerated, but required. Women reaching toward the felt sense that there is something on the other side of what could be measured. The state spent the next 165 years trying to make that a crime. Kate Fox would have been 93 years old in 1945. She didn't make it that long, but if she had, she would have watched Beck Lawrence's grandmother be born into a Pennsylvania where the law was still exactly the same. That might be nothing, but then again, it might be something.